Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Another day, another morning. Is the coffee brewing? Do you still have lunches to pack? Maybe you're waiting for the car to warm up? Well, that is the perfect time for The Connector. Boise State Public Radio brings you the latest Idaho news every weekday morning with this podcast. It's fast, it's focused, and it's ready when you are. Just press play and stay connected. Listen to The Connector Idaho Daily News wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. School choice, selling public lands, Ammon Bundy and St. Luke's, as well as an ICE raid in Wilder and an ever-expanding state budget shortfall. These were just some of the top stories that made headlines in 2025. Well, today, it's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. But today, we will look back at those stories with our end-of-year Reporter Roundtable. And our panel today includes Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Kevin Richert, senior reporter and blogger with Idaho Education News, and our very own James Dawson with Boise State Public Radio. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Gemma.
Hey, Gemma.
All right. As I said, we are going to take this next hour and look back on those big stories of 2025. And Kevin, I want to begin with the 2025 legislative session and the passing of House Bill 93. Now, this was private school choice. There had been a push in the State House for a few years, Kevin, to get some type of school choice passed. And last session, it finally happened, even though it was overwhelmingly unpopular with Idahoans. So, Kevin, can you give us a brief overview of what this bill will do?
Well, it will create a $50 million tax credit that parents can use to put towards non-public education. So this is the first time Idaho has put public money into private schools in this way. Like you said, this has been a debate at the State House for several years. It is an outgrowth of a national debate over private school choice. Idaho, one of the most conservative states in the union, with one of the most conservative legislatures in the nation. It took several years to get here. It was hotly debated within the legislature. All Democrats, minority Democrats opposed it. A handful of Republicans opposed it as well. And as you mentioned, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails to the governor's office leading up to his signing of this bill. A lot of opposition voiced in those letters and voicemails and emails. Governor signed it into law in late February. It goes into effect. For all practical purposes, it would go into effect early part of next year.
Okay, so Kevin, as you said, supposed to go into effect early 2026. There's a lawsuit underway already, though. So tell us about that and then what the chances are that we'll actually see it move forward in the new year.
Well, I would figure we would know pretty quickly. The lawsuit that was filed last fall would seek to block the implementation of the law. Really, nothing has happened in terms of implementation of the law yet. It will roll out, assuming that this lawsuit does not stop the law from going into effect. The law is scheduled to start to really kick in January. That's when parents can apply for these tax credits. But the lawsuit seeks to try to stop that from happening.
Okay, so we just basically have to watch this lawsuit to see what happens.
A lot of wait and see. But
okay.
it was definitely geared towards the rollout date, which is in mid-January. So I would imagine we will hear from the court sooner, not later.
All right. So, Jimmy, another big story, and this one goes back to 2022, and that is Ammon Bundy being ordered to pay $52 million to St. Luke's Health System. So start out, if you would, by refreshing our memories on this story.
Yeah, I feel like I need to take a huge breath here because it's going to be a
Yeah.
little long. So, like you said, we do have to go back to 2022. Ammon Bundy's good friend, Diego Rodriguez, began making noise on social media that his grandson had been, quote, kidnapped by law enforcement and taken to St. Luke's for treatment. Uh, Keep in mind, this grandson had some health complications going on at the time. I believe he was less than a year old, if I'm remembering correctly. And authorities said that his parents just hadn't brought him to a required medical appointment earlier that day. So they had pulled over Diego Rodriguez's daughter and son-in-law who had the child with him and took him to the hospital. So this led Bundy calling on his followers to join him in protesting at St. Luke's, which happened over the course of a couple days. Had lots of people show up, including current and former state lawmakers. You had the health system. They were alleging that the health system was profiting from what they view as child trafficking. So St. Luke's ultimately locked down its downtown campus for about a
Hmm.
couple hours. Had to reroute ambulances elsewhere because of the threats it was receiving. Court documents said that people from more than 30 states had called the hospital that day with death threats to staff, to doctors, to hospital administrators. Um, Eventually, the child was medically cleared and returned to his parents. And after that, St. Luke's sued Bundy and Rodriguez in civil court for defamation. Over the course of that time, both men repeatedly failed to show up to court hearings, and ultimately, a jury awarded the hospital, as you said, more than $50 million in damages. So that's when you have to fast forward a couple years to 2024, and that's when Bundy filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in Utah to try to get that judgment thrown out.
Okay, so he tries to get the judgment thrown out, Jimmy, and what happens?
Yeah, so should say that yes, there are circumstances where bankruptcy you can discharge a court-ordered debt, but the thing is you have to meet certain requirements to do so. So
Hmm.
ultimately, the judge in this case had to weigh whether Bundy was acting in a willful and malicious manner in the original court case. Bundy, through a bunch of motions and other maneuvers, tried to get the bankruptcy court to relitigate these things, which is not what the bankruptcy court can do. We learned a lot more about his finances, like Bundy admitting he had transferred ownership of his house in Emmett to a friend to try to shield it from being seized, for to try to pay off that $52 million debt. Um, Hospital argued he was hiding other assets, businesses, another house in a different state, all of these things. But ultimately, the judge in the case said, no, like if you acted in a willful and malicious manner, you have to pay this judgment, which is now more than $60 million with interest.
All right. So, Jimmy, if I'm remembering correctly, that federal judge made that decision earlier this year. Um, I mean, do we know if Bundy has paid any of this close to what you said, $60 million dollars now back to St. Luke's?
So what we do know is that after the Idaho judgment was put into effect, that kind of gives the prevailing party, in this case St. Luke's, access to bank accounts and things like that. So St. Luke's was able to recover a little bit of money from his various bank accounts. He had to sell some other assets and things like that, but nowhere close to the $60 million. Not that he even argued that he had $60 million, nor did St. Luke
Hmm.
say that he doesn't have that kind of scratch lying around. But they are in the process of trying to recover as much money as they can.
All right. Appreciate that update on that, Jimmy. So, Clark, protecting public lands in Idaho became a big issue this year as there was a proposal in Congress to actually sell millions of acres of federal public lands, quite a bit of that being here in Idaho. So, can you tell us about this?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. This really became a big issue this year, but it started with U.S. Senator Mike Lee, a Republican out of Utah. As you mentioned, he had a proposal in Congress that would have made millions of acres of public land, including right here in Idaho, available to be sold off. to the highest bidder. And when we're talking about public land, that includes things like U.S. Forest Service land, Bureau of Land Management land. And it's a big deal because about 60% of Idaho is actually public land of some form or another. Now, Senator Lee's proposal ultimately failed. He tried to have this included in a provision of what became the One Big Beautiful Bill that President Trump signed into law over the summer, but it failed and it was taken out. But it kind of it galvanized all this support for public lands, Gemma, as we saw both in Idaho and across the West. There were people speaking out about it. There were rallies that people were writing their elected representatives, and it just became super unpopular. I saw one poll that was 96% of Idaho voters opposed the idea of making public land available to be sold off. And so that was one of these unique issues that people were unified across political ideologies about their support of public lands. It didn't matter if they were Republicans, if they were Democrats, or if they were independents. People in Idaho and people across the West support their public land, and they were completely opposed to it being sold off. And so although that proposal ultimately was unsuccessful, the issue hasn't gone away. Gemma, recently Idaho Capital Sun reporter Laura Guido had a story out about how U.S. Representative Russ Fulcher said that there are imminent talks about transferring federal public lands or selling public lands to the state. So it's not an issue that's gone away, even though the initial proposal from Senator Lee that sort of galvanized the public failed. It's not an issue that's going away, and it may come up during the upcoming 2026 legislative session that starts just in a couple weeks here in Idaho. One state senator, Senator Ben Adams, has already pledged to pursue a constitutional amendment that would be designed to protect any future public lands that Idaho obtains from the federal government from being sold off. We also have, in addition to federal lands, we have issues with state lands. There was a big issue this year that was extremely unpopular where state officials voted to sell off 160 acres of state endowment land located in eastern Idaho near the Tetons, and to make that available to sell to the highest bidder. And so public lands really is an issue that continues to be front and center for a lot of Idahoans and a lot of folks across the West, Gemma.
All right, appreciate that, Clark. So, Kevin, a teacher in the West Ada School District put a sign up in her classroom that said everyone is welcome here. And when she was told to take that sign down, not only did this story make headlines here, this went viral. I mean, it made national headlines. So, Kevin, remind us of what happened and why she wasn't allowed to display that sign.
So Sarah Inama was a middle school teacher in the West Ada School District who I don't think many people had heard of at all until early this year. The whole controversy began when she was asked to take down a couple of posters in her classroom, one that had the slogan, "Everyone is welcome here." As you said, it became a viral story. It went national, and it bled into a debate that we saw unfold at the State House, all of us, over signs and posters in classrooms, and ultimately the legislature did pass a law on this. We'll get back to that in a second. But the controversy within the West Ada district really centered around Inama and her classroom and how the district wanted to respond to it. And the district had basically put together a new policy that they passed in the spring on posters and displays in classrooms that they feel is in line with what the legislature passed. As for Inama, she resigned over this. She wound up taking a job with the Boise School District. The Boise District has taken a very different tack on this whole debate. District administrators have said, we don't believe that the slogan, "Everyone is welcome here," is a political phrase at all. We think that it's a basic basic statement of values. So they have leaned into the messaging, and Anama now works in the Boise School District. So very different attitudes and perspectives from that we're seeing from the two largest school districts in the state that neighbor each other.
So, Kevin, what exactly does the law say, and where does everything stand now? Because the Attorney General got involved in this entire issue.
Right. Yeah, the legislature get involved. You also had Attorney General Raul Labrador get involved and issued a statement saying that he believed that the "Everyone is Welcome Here" posters are a political statement and would be in violation of the law. The law that passed prohibits flags or banners in classrooms that would express a political opinion, faith, or religious message. And it's been interesting to watch what's been unfolding since that law went into effect. There was a lot of controversy about that bill in the legislature, obviously a lot of controversy in West Ada about Sarah and Nama. What's happened
Mm-hmm.
over the past few months, our Emma Epperly has been following it. In the 5 months that this law has been in effect, only 2 complaints have come into the state regarding messaging in the classroom. So in spite of all of this furor around West Ada and their decision and the legislature weighing in on this issue, there really has not been much backlash on the ground in schools so far this year.
All right. So, Clark, Boise made national headlines not once, but twice. And I guess we should say Idaho, but in particular Boise, due to the big turnout at 2 No Kings rallies that were held at the State House this year. So let's start with this, Clark. Remind us of what these protests were, because they were held all over the country.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gemma. They were called No Kings protests, and they were a couple of different groups organized them, but Idaho 5051 was one of the groups that was putting this on. And these were massive protests and rallies that were held all across the United States. There were big ones at the Idaho State Capitol in Boise, but also in cities and towns throughout Idaho, talking about like Idaho Falls and Pocatello and Rexburg, Nampa. And so it wasn't just 1 or 2 big rallies in Boise, but these took place in June and then again in October. And it was thousands of people coming together and speaking out and protesting against the policies enacted by President Donald Trump and the federal government, and specifically pushing back against ICE and some of the ICE partnerships. I was just looking at our story from June, and I was with Christina Lords, our editor, and we went up to the 4th floor of the state capitol building in Boise and took a photo of the rally there. And Christina's photo, it just shows an absolute sea of people that were covering Jefferson Street and Cecil DeAndres Memorial Park in front of the Idaho State Capitol. And just as far as you could see from the steps of the Capitol all the way down to Bannock Street was just a sea of people gathered and holding signs, speaking out, exercising their constitutional right to free speech and speaking out against some of the policies from President Trump and the federal government. But they were some of the largest rallies and protests that I've ever seen at the Idaho State Capitol. But as you talked about, Jim, I think the thing that makes it noteworthy is it wasn't just limited to Boise like we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
There were rallies in hundreds of cities across the country and in dozens of cities and towns across Idaho. And those were held in both June and October, those large protests, Gemma.
And Clark, what you said about these protests being held in smaller areas of Idaho. I mean, I think one could argue that these protests were so large in Boise, there aren't enough Democrats to make that crowd. But then when you go outside of the Treasure Valley in particular, I mean, we're talking, even Driggs, right? Over in very far east Idaho, there were these rallies. In having covered politics for as long as you have, I mean, what stood out to you the most about the significance not of this big turnout in Boise, but these turnouts across very red Idaho?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what stood out to me about it, Gemma, is the significance and the organization to have it take place in communities across the state. It wasn't just one area, it wasn't just one part of the state. I think that's what stood out to me is that on two given days, there were efforts all across the state in cities and towns, pretty much in every corner of Idaho. There were rallies and protests in North Idaho and rural, remote Eastern Idaho, as you talked about, here in Western Idaho and in Southern Idaho as well. And so I think that was the thing that stood out to me that I hadn't really seen at that level was those amount of protests in different communities in multiple counties across the state in every corner of Idaho. I think that was the thing that stood out. It wasn't just isolated to one event or one particular part of the state or one group of people. It was Idahoans all across the state and people all across the country, really, that were speaking out, that were exercising their constitutional right to speak out about concerns with their government. I think that's the lasting impression that I will have is first and foremost, I was at the Boise rallies, and so that visceral, those images of those huge crowds coming out sticks with me. But overall, like you said, the impact across the state, where it was in every corner of Idaho that people turned out to speak out and to exercise their right to speak out and protest.
So, Kevin, Boise State's president left for a new job. I know she got the job in March of 25. But let's fast forward 9 months later to now. The university is not even close to naming a new president. So why has this search taken so long? And some have said it's been a very flawed search, Kevin.
Yeah, I think I put that in a headline a few weeks ago. It has definitely taken longer than anybody at the State Board of Education wanted it to, or hoped that it would, or expected it to, because you're right. We are now 9 months in, and to this point, we have had no finalists named. We've had no candidates named whatsoever. We don't know any names of folks who've applied. We've had no candidates come in for in-person interviews or in-person appearances on the campus, which is kind of the protocol. It's hard to tell what's happened here because the state board has been very closed-mouthed about the process. They had a search committee that began this work in the spring. That search committee operated under non-disclosure agreements. So we don't know who they've spoken to. We know that they had a round of closed interviews with semifinalists. That's back in August. But even though they got to that point, and even though the closed door process led to that point where they brought in candidates and they did interviews in the Boise airport, we don't know what became of any of those candidates, whether they're still in the running, whether they've pulled out. But we do know that in October, the state board put the search on pause and they kind of did a reset. I'm thinking at this point, it's not likely we're going to see a new president at Boise State until at least the spring, because what the state board has said publicly is that, well, maybe this process is going to play out through the school year, and that maybe isn't the worst thing because presidential candidates might not want to leave their current job in the middle of the year. So maybe it will take until spring. So I think we're going to be into this well into the spring, and there is a public transparency issue that surfaces through all of this.
So talk to us about that, Kevin, about this public transparency issue.
Yeah. So according to the state law, the state board is supposed to announce a list of 5 finalists. And that's the field. That's the short list that I was talking about before. These are the candidates who are brought in. They're publicly named. They come onto a campus traditionally, and they'll have meetings with anybody who wants to show up, kind of town halls with students, with faculty, with staff. Those would be open to the public. Those would be open to the media. That has been the process that the state has used before. It's the same process that they used just a couple of years ago when they had a vacancy at Idaho State University. You now have the state board openly grumbling about this process and saying that it's getting in the way of having candidates stay in the running. They're saying that if you're president at another college or university, you don't want your name out publicly, even as a finalist. You don't want to be outed as a job hunter if you have a 1 in 5 chance of ultimately getting the job that you've applied for. So they say that it's getting in the way of getting candidates to apply and stay in the running. But that's what the law is right now. So it'll be interesting to see if anybody tries to change that law and claw back the one phase of this process that is public. So it
Mm.
will be interesting to see how that plays out at the legislative session while this search continues in whatever fashion it's continuing, because it's been radio silence here really since the search was put on hold in early October.
Well, and Kevin, I mean, at some point, there needs to be a new president named. And I mean, 9 months is a long time for it to remain vacant. I mean, yes, there's an interim president, but you almost put in a lot of ways a university on hold, even with an interim president.
And it all comes at a time. You're right about all of that. I mean, 9 months and counting, and you do want to have somebody in for the long haul so that you can get out of this sort of transition, so that you can, you know, fill some other high level positions
Hmm.
on campus. It also comes at a time where Boise State is facing a lot of challenges. Idaho higher education is facing a lot of challenges. You have budget cuts. Well, we're going to talk a lot about the budget as we go here. But you've had budget cuts have affected higher education. You have a new law affecting DEI programs, trying to basically ban DEI on Idaho college campuses. Boise State, in particular, has been in the eye of the political storm at the state house for several years. This is not an this is an attractive job in the sense that it's a growing university. It's got a national profile. It's growing enrollment. It's growing research. It's growing in fundraising. But it is also, yeah, at a time and in a state where higher education is under a lot of scrutiny.
Right. I want to turn now to another very big story. And Jimmy and Clark, I'd like both of you to jump in on this. And that was the recent ICE raid in Wilder. So, Jimmy, set the scene for us and give us the basics of what happened.
Yeah, so you have this horse track that was outside of Wilder. About 400 people were in attendance for some horse racing back in October. And ultimately, a whole lot of law enforcement, ranging from local, county, state, and then also federal agencies, descended on this track. About 105 were ultimately arrested. And they were there for an alleged illegal gambling ring,
Mm.
which involved 5 people that the FBI was going after. But again, 105 were ultimately arrested. You had the owner of the horse track, Ivan Telez, and a few of his associates allegedly running this, gambling operation for these horse races. Court documents showed Telez had been depositing significant amounts of cash over several bank accounts over the last couple of years, one of which had more than $100,000 in it. And authorities also showed that Facebook messages, they say that they alleged to bets being placed by people before the horse races. But obviously, as
Mm.
we talked about, significantly more people were arrested than just the 5 people mentioned in the original court documents. You had news outlets across the valley reporting that many U.S. citizens were detained, who were eventually released, but that also some children were zip tied during this operation. And ultimately, immigration and customs enforcement took in 105 people.
Mm. All right. So, Clark, my understanding is that the governor and the Idaho State Police basically forged a partnership with ICE. And this raised quite a few questions, but also a lot of criticism about this particular raid. So, can you tell us about this part of it?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. Yeah, and you're exactly right. These were partnerships that were authorized at the very highest level of state government. The Governor Brad Little a couple of times announced these partnerships between different agencies in Idaho and ICE for deportation operations. And I was just looking back through some of our coverage, but in June, I reported that the Idaho State Police announced a partnership with ICE to spend $300,000 of taxpayer money in Idaho transporting inmates to ICE facilities. And then in August, Governor Brad Little announced that the National Guard was being authorized to support ICE activities in the state of Idaho. Also, a couple of different counties and law enforcement agencies on their own have entered into partnerships with ICE here at the local level. But you're exactly right. These are things that were authorized by Governor Little, that were authorized partnerships from the highest level of state government. And the result has been, well, Laura Guido for the Idaho Capital Sun had an article out this fall talking about overall there's a sharp increase in ICE detentions in the state of Idaho this year following these partnerships and these authorizations between organizations like the governor's office, between organizations like Idaho State Police and the Idaho National Guard, Gemma.
And Jimmy, since that raid happened, you mentioned a lot of these 105 people. Some have been released, have some been deported? I mean, where are we with this?
Yeah, so Carolyn Kamatsoulis from the Idaho Statesman has reported that since that raid, at least 15 immigrants have been released from custody by a federal judge here in Idaho, mostly because these are folks who had active permanent residency applications or asylum requests. They'd been trying to go through the process for, sometimes, dozens of years. And Judge Lynn Windmill released these immigrants because he says that they still have due process rights under the Constitution, even though they are not citizens. So, as you can imagine, the Trump administration pushed back. A spokesperson for Homeland Security told the Statesman that Windmill is a, quote, activist judge who's, quote, ordering lawbreakers to roam free. Something else that Carolyn has reported is that this raid has cost taxpayers more than $35,000 in costs. That's between the Nampa and Caldwell police departments. Idaho State Police and Canyon County Sheriff's Office also participated in the raid, but they did not provide any sort of cost documentation to their public records requests. Caldwell Police Chief Rex Ingram told the newspaper in a statement that Caldwell Police responded in a support capacity and that it does so with any sort of requests from other law enforcement when they have the personnel available.
We have a little bit more than 10 minutes left, and I want to take these final moments to talk about what has become a significant story in 2025 and will likely become an even bigger story in 26, and that is the budget shortfall Idaho is facing. So, Jimmy, let's begin with a bill that Governor Little signed into law back in March. This was about a $250 million tax cut. So tell us about this.
Yeah, that's right. And this is the biggest portion of the overall $450 million in tax cuts approved during the last session. So this is one that cuts personal and corporate income tax rates from roughly 5.7% to 5.3%. And, if you ask Republican lawmakers who voted for it, the philosophy behind it is by letting Idahoans keep more money in their pockets, it's going to incentivize more people and businesses to move here, and for those that are already here, have more money to spend in the economy in the long run. So the problem is that revenue hasn't reflected that boost in the economic growth yet, especially in the corporate arena, which I'm sure Clark will talk about a little bit more, but it's kind of an eye-popping number. It's down 42% from economic forecasts so far this fiscal year, which is substantially more than the, roughly, I think it's 0.7% difference in what they expected for individual income taxes.
So, Clark, come into this conversation because this tax cut has had some major ripple effects. And I have to say, you've been on the program a handful of times already talking about this budget shortfall, and I'm still having a difficult time wrapping my head around it for the pure fact that the one thing that our Idaho Constitution requires is that our legislature sets a balanced budget. So it is mind-blowing to think that we now have this budget deficit. Some say it's upwards of $1.9 billion. But how did that tax cut impact state revenue? And to Jimmy's point, corporate Idaho.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. And it's something I've tried to keep an eye on. And it always gets a little complicated when we talk about budgets. But really, you're exactly right, Jim. The Idaho Constitution requires the Idaho legislature to pass a balanced budget every year. It's arguably the one and only, it's the main requirement that our legislature is bound to, really, when it comes to the annual legislative session. The biggest rule is you have to pass a balanced budget. And it's important to note that what we're talking about is projections right now. It's estimates, it's the latest reports. But the reason we got here has everything to do with the tax cuts. There's kind of a couple of different sides of the budget, but you can think of it in terms of your own budget at home. You've got your expenses, which is the amount of money that Idaho spends every year on all its programs. And the reason the budget's important is because we're talking about money that's available for public schools. It's money that's available to pay the salaries and benefits for thousands and thousands of state employees. It's money available for public safety through Idaho State Police. It's money to pay for infrastructure projects and road and bridge repairs. And it's money that the state needs to fight wildfires that take place on state-controlled land every year. So you've got two sides of the budgets. You've got your expenses, and then you've got the revenue. And that's where the tax cuts come in, because the state's largest source of revenue, Gemma, is through tax collections. It's specifically the individual and corporate income tax and the sales tax. And so every time that the state of Idaho cuts taxes, yes, it's a reduction in the amount of money that either a business or an individual pays in taxes. But at the same time, what it also does is it reduces the amount of revenue available to the state for its budget, for spending on programs like wildfires and public schools and public infrastructure projects. And so Jimmy's right to talk about the impact of the tax cuts. And I actually looked at kind of this watchdog report that was provided by a nonprofit organization here in Boise called the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. And they didn't just look at the $450 million of tax cuts this year. They looked at 5 years worth of tax cuts. And by their calculations, over the last 5 years, the state of Idaho reduced revenue, again, that pool of money that's available for the state budget. State of Idaho reduced revenue by $4 billion, billion with a B, over the last 5 years, paying for income taxes. And so that's money that's not available to go to the state budget. And interestingly, the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, in their report, they found that the tax cuts primarily benefited corporations and wealthy Idahoans earning more than $738,000 a year, that these tax cuts benefited those folks more than it benefited Idaho working families and Idaho families with low incomes. But you're exactly right. At the end of the day, what that leaves us in is we have a projected budget deficit for our current fiscal year in 2026, but an even larger projected deficit for 2027, which is the budget that legislators are going to have to set during the new legislative session that starts just in a couple of weeks on January 12th at the Idaho State Capitol. And so this isn't, I guess that would be my big takeaway, is that there have been years of tax cuts and revenue reductions that led into this. And this is not just a problem limited to the current budget year that we're in. The numbers that I've seen show that this revenue shortfall, this budget shortfall, is going to affect state budgets in our current year, 2026, next year, 2027, and the year after that, in 2028 as well. And I have been told by key state legislators and officials in the governor's office that they're going to intervene to prevent the state from actually posting a budget deficit when the fiscal year ends on June 30th. But to do that, they're going to likely have to enact a series of new budget cuts that are deeper, and in addition to the budget cuts that Governor Brad Little already proposed. And so I think that's one of the big things that we'll be watching this legislative session, is how does the legislature? How does Governor Brad Little intervene to avoid a budget shortfall? And some of the representatives that I've talked to, particularly House Minority Leader Ilana Rubel, a Boise Democrat, is worried that these cuts that the legislature will make to avoid a budget deficit are going to have wide-ranging effects on people across Idaho. And she pointed to some letters that the Idaho Sheriff's Association has sent to the state legislature and to the governor's office, warning that cuts to vital mental health services could create a public safety risk for the state of Idaho. And so I know that's one of the things in terms of why does it matter? Why are we paying attention to these budget projections and these complicated budget forecasts, is because it affects money that's available for all these services that the state government provides. And so I know that's one of the big things that I'll be watching during this upcoming legislative session is what steps does the state take to avoid a deficit? And then if they go with new additional cuts, what programs will that affect, and how will that affect Idaho families and the public in Idaho, Gemma?
And Kevin, all of this does not bode well for education, in particular special education. Is it fair to say that there is a crisis when it comes to funding when we're talking about special education?
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, everything that Clark and Jimmy have talked about, this budget crunch is going to affect just about everything we talk about in education, because there's nothing free in education. I mean, so far, K-12 has been spared from the budget cuts, unlike higher education. Will that continue? Or if Clark, as Clark said, they have to cut deeper into this budget to balance the books this year, will K-12 hit a cut? Very possibly. What happens to the Idaho Launch Program at $75 million a year? And what does happen with Superintendent Debbie Critchfield's proposal to put $50 million into special ed? Special ed is in crisis mode. There is about a $100 million gap between what the state and the feds give school districts to cover SPED programs and what the actual cost is. So this $50 million would cover some of that gap. It's going to be tough sledding to try to get $50 million of new money in this legislature, through this legislature, in this session. Everything we talk about in education is, it ties back to the budget, ties back to this budget crisis. It's going to be a wild session because there just isn't that much money to go around, and there are a lot of competing interests and a lot of competing needs. Just within education alone. I mean, what we just talked about with launch, special education, medical education, it's going to be a very complicated and very contentious session because there just isn't much money, but there's a lot of demand for it.
And very quickly, I have about a minute left. Jimmy, what about this rainy day fund? Why is that not being tapped into?
Well, it still might be. I mean, the thing is that the legislature has, I think it's a little over 20% of, the current year's budget in terms of dollars, kind of socked away. That has been a big priority of Brad Little's administration, each year putting, millions and millions of dollars into these rainy day funds. It's not out of, the question that got brought up during these fall JFAC meetings as a possible way to sort of bridge any gap. But I think that the first and foremost thing, in the front of lawmakers' minds on JFAC and across the legislature is cutting the budget for long-term stability, as opposed to using this money, kind of as a 1 or 2 year stopgap to wait for revenues to recover.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for taking time to go through the big stories of this last year. It's been greatly appreciated. A big thank you to our panelists today, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Kevin Richards, senior reporter and blogger with Idaho Education News, and our very own James Dawson with Boise State Public Radio. We really appreciate you all coming back on to talk about these top stories. And I want to thank all of our Idaho reporters who come onto our Reporter Roundtable every single Friday. It is a big, heavy lift. I would encourage all of you to go read all of the reporting that they do. We are lucky to have the journalists here in Idaho that we do. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
Looking for another podcast to listen to? Check out The Nature of Idaho from our partner station KISU in Eastern Idaho. Join hosts Peter Pruitt and Dr. Leif Tapanilla as they share fascinating stories from the Gem State's great outdoors, celebrating Idaho's wildlife, landscape, and natural wonders. That's The Nature of Idaho from KISU. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.